a virtue ethicist. I don't know if you've read much of his writing or know of him, Justin, but he's quite influential in transhumanism.
Yeah, Max Moore's associated with the Extropy Institute, extropianism, West Coast transhumanism, very libertarian. Whereas I suppose my background, Nick Bostrom's background, is more left liberal European transhumanism, but extraordinarily simplistic, these left-right labels. Yeah. But anyway, yes, though statistically I would guess most transhumanists are utilitarians of some description. You know, the Christian transhumanists, Max Moore is a virtue ethicist. Don't know if there are that many deontologists. The utilitarians are probably split between probably, I don't know what ratio of preference to classical utilitarians with negative utilitarians such as me being distinctly a minority.
Well, it seems though there is also a few ethical egoists or rational egoists as far as consequentialism goes. Yeah.
Yes.
Whether they actually outwardly espouse the ideals or they just practice them themselves. Yeah. Like for instance, Zoltanism.
Yes. Zoltan was the US Transhumanist Party presidential candidate I mentioned, and his particular focus is life extension, but he's been influenced by Ayn Rand and objectivism.
Oh, I see,
Yes. And there's quite a gulf between Zoltan's conception of transhumanism and my own notion of a kind of pan-species welfare state, shall we say?
Yeah.
Look, we get on well, but yes, many different strands to transhumanism.
Yeah, I can see. It's interesting to see the development of the virtue ethics literature on human enhancement, because there are so many different issues one could look at. But from what I've been seeing in the last few years, some virtue ethicists have been looking at moral enhancement and, you know, whether it's okay to help oneself become more courageous, for example. And, you know, we're talking about this but recently and thinking about something like courage and, you know, whether it somehow diminishes one's virtue if one uses, let's say, pharmacological means to be more courageous. Even just things like beta blockers to, you know, give evidence if one's a whistleblower against an incompetent surgeon at a government inquiry. And to me, that doesn't really diminish one's courage or one's virtue to do that. So I don't know if there's any necessary incompatibility between virtue and human enhancement, the way I look at it.
Oh, to become virtuous, at least in the case of most of us, we would need quite substantial enhancements. I think one of the complications of human enhancement is that if one is an ethical utilitarian, ethical utilitarianism is associated with being a rule-bound systematizer. Utilitarians tend to have above average AQ scores, Asperger's quotient, and therefore insofar as one is enhancing one's capacity to be a good ethical utilitarian, one is not enhancing virtue in the more normal sense.
Yeah, because it's more of a sort of narrow track disposition rather than a broader one, that's usual traditional Aristotelian conception of what a virtue is. Yeah.
If one actually looks though at the evolutionary origins of what we conceive of as the virtues, presumably if it had been fitness enhancing in the ancestral environment to eat your mother or have sex with your sister, this would be regarded as virtuous. Does it trouble you that our intuitions of the nature of virtue are shaped to such a degree by our evolutionary heritage?
I'm not really troubled in that way, because I tend to think of an account of the virtues as underpinned by science more than intuition. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, being very much an Aristotelian, I tend to think that our understanding of a flourishing human life needs to be based on things like anthropology as well as evolutionary biology. And so, that might lead to some rather counterintuitive ideas about what would count as a virtue. But I know that a lot of the time these days, a lot of work in virtue ethics seems to be fairly sort of traditional, but I think, and not counterintuitive perhaps, but I think it should be open to that. We should be open to discovering that there are better ways in which humans can flourish than what we currently realise.
Yeah, I mean, one of the advantages of aiming, as I think we should, for radical hedonic enrichment, an elevated hedonic set point, is that it is possible, at least in principle, to be virtuous in a conventional sense, even if one's hedonic set point is radically enhanced. I don't know what you think of this as a kind of compromise option, i.e. it's not a case that necessarily we should be aiming for maximum bliss, to be totally blissed out all the time, but simply that our default hedonic tone should be richer, perhaps vastly richer than today. Does this strike you as an appealing option once it becomes technically feasible?
Yeah, I'd be interested to know more about the means that might be used to do that. But in terms of it being a goal, I tend to think that there are a range of different intrinsically good things, and so it wouldn't just be pleasure or minimisation of suffering, but it would also be things like friendship, even where friendship might involve, a bit of a struggle at times or challenges. So I tend to think that there are other intrinsic goods like compassion. So therefore it's sometimes a good thing if you share someone else's suffering. But I don't think that all of these things, despite being intrinsic goods, are things that we ought to maximise no matter what. And so I think I'm not putting forward a theodicy, for example. I think they're sort of intrinsic goods, but in certain circumstances they can become bad. So I don't think we should, for example, promote compassion no matter what.
What was it Plato said? Pleasure is the greatest incentive to evil. I don't know if strictly this is the case, but certainly I am not a hedonist in the traditional sense. Just occasionally people have come to visit in Brighton and imagining some kind of lifestyle of drink, drugs and debauchery, and they find I have a very austere, if not puritanical lifestyle.
What do you think about if you take the example of friendship as intrinsically good, above and beyond the sort of good, pleasurable experiences that it gives you? I just find, maybe from personal experience, amongst other things, that what really helps to bond people together in a friendship is going through shared challenges and a bit of a shared struggle together in terms of overcoming and meeting various obstacles in life. And so I did wonder about your approach and how that would address that. Would you think, for example, that if sharing those struggles can bring one closer as friends in ways that maybe sharing more pleasurable experiences couldn't, that we should allow for the possibility of struggle, if you like, because it leads to this other intrinsic good of friendship?
Yes, I mean, on a personal level, friendship is important to me, and yet I suppose part of me is troubled by the notion that in some sense it is underpinned by our endogenous opioid system, and that without this underpinning of opioid release, in what sense would one be valuing friendship? Part of me prefers a lot of the time not to think too deeply about the nature of our relationships. But in terms of struggle and shared experience, I mean, it may sound a cop-out, but this idea that if one does recalibrate the hedonic treadmill, yes, one can still, pursue all the kind of activities, the challenges, the team sports, the kind of activities one might enjoy already. It doesn't involve sacrificing anything, but potentially it can make it far more rewarding. One thing that did trouble me, I mean, we value friendship and loyalty and self-sacrifice, but this is one thing that I used to brood about a little as a teenager many years ago, that I know that under interrogation by the Gestapo I would crack within 10 seconds. One might like to think of oneself as a loyal and trustworthy friend with that kind of virtuous character. I know I would break very rapidly. In some sense, depression is associated with weakness, whereas one of the advantages of using biotechnology for different forms of human enhancement is not merely that we can recalibrate the hedonic treadmill, ensure life is more subjectively rewarding, but one can also, in principle at any rate, turn oneself into an idealized version of the kind of person one would like to be, and without claiming that I eat babies for breakfast or anything terrible like that, I am a very sorry approximation of the kind of person I would love to be.
You gave somebody something to worry about then.
There's a little baby that was worried about.
Maybe they didn't hear you properly, but yeah. Enough about babies for breakfast there, David.
How closely do you approximate the kind of person you would like to be?
That's a very challenging question. I think I've still pretty clearly got some way to go to be the sort of person that I don't know, just like to be, but also more of a sort of idealised, aspirational version of myself. And it's what you were talking about before, I suppose, in thinking about character traits being kind of locally robust, but globally there might be worries about what you might do if you're in Auschwitz, for example, or if you're being interrogated by the Gestapo. For me, I often think in this connection about the Milgrim Experiments. That's a kind of classic study to suggest that a lot of us would crumble under that kind of pressure, where we're ordered to do something that, to all intents and purposes, seems to involve killing someone else with a lethal electric shock. And, for me, what's interesting about the inferences that people tend to make from those studies, and I'm not saying that you do, is that often they don't look at people's reasons, what was going on in the minds of the subjects who did give the extreme shocks, because they tend to look just at behaviour. And I think, say in the Milgrim Experiments, that often the subjects had some inkling that maybe the shock machine wasn't real.
Yes.
In which case you wouldn't be so bothered by following orders to give 450 volt shocks to this learner. So I think what's really important with a lot of the arguments that support this idea that actually underneath we're not as virtuous as we think is that they tend to just look at behaviour. But if we look at reasons and construals in the minds of people, maybe it's not quite as damning as what is traditionally inferred from those studies.
Yes, I mean, as well as, if you like, the nasty examples, turning this on its head, as it were, I used to read the lives of the Roman emperors, and I used to wonder, how would I behave if I had absolute power? And I don't know if you've ever considered, if you were catapulted, notionally of course, into a position of being Ottoman Sultan or Roman Emperor, how would you behave? I mean, there's this familiar quote from Lord Acton, all power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I realised however much I would want to go down in history as Dave the Good or Dave the Just, I would probably end up just as depraved as most of them. Admittedly, I couldn't imagine myself wanting to torture slaves or have it off with senators' wives or anything like that. But nonetheless, in some sense, it's an insight into who we are as people, how humans actually behave when they do have absolute power. And you look at the lives of the Ottoman sultans with their harems and how they behave. In some sense, yes, I know. I do think of humans as with a fundamental predisposition to be depraved.
Yeah, well, I mean, Kant had this idea that you could never find true virtue anywhere in the world for those kinds of reasons, and you could never find true friendship anywhere in the world because secretly, even the supposed best of friends privately rejoice at each other's failings. But To me, that's too high a standard to set for virtue. I mean, I don't know whether it's even true that the best of friends, enjoy each other's failings, but I think that's just at least thinking about this from an epistemic point of view, in terms of when are we kind of warranted in attributing a virtuous character trait or a true friendship to someone else. I don't think we need to look at the extremities, if you like. I don't think it needs to be as global as that in order for us to be justified in attributing true friendship or true virtue to someone else. But, I mean, that might sound like a bit of a cop-out, because you could think, oh, well, that means we don't need to engage in these interesting speculations about what we might do. But, to me, this is something I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. There are some cases where we do want to know, we are interested in, and it matters what we might do at the extremities. So can I just talk about the friendship case a little bit? One of the big issues about whether a utilitarian can be a true friend is about, well, under what conditions would a utilitarian abandon the relationship? And so, if Oxfam required you on good grounds, on sort of good evidence-based grounds, to abandon a relationship and go and work for famine relief and not be on Facebook or anything else, and sort of not be able to maintain the friendship, then that's what you ought to do. And, if someone has those dispositions in a relationship and you're finding this out, let's say one's not utilitarian, and then they say to you, well, don't worry, it's highly unlikely to ever happen, a lot of people wouldn't find that very reassuring. So I think in those cases, even though the scenario might be rather remote, that you might have to leave, we do take that, a lot of people would take that as indicating something about the nature of the relationship and think maybe it's not a true friendship. So it's interesting, in some cases the sort of remote scenarios are informative about whether it's a true friendship and maybe whether it's a genuine virtue as well, if you apply that reasoning to the character trait, to a character trait example.
To what extent do you think criticisms of utilitarian ethics are implicitly appealing to the bad consequences that would notionally follow from pursuing utilitarian ethics, i.e. implicitly suggesting, therefore, that what are supposedly utilitarian policies aren't really utilitarian policies at all?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some of that in some of the standard objections to utilitarianism. But other times I think maybe there's a basic disagreement in value, say between agent-relative values and agent-neutral values, although some consequentialists embrace some agent-relative values. But another disagreement might be just in terms of the plurality of intrinsic goods that there are. But, utilitarians are a broad church too, as we know, and, there are so many different versions around that can try to accommodate even, a lot of the standard objections. I still think there would be some differences, basic differences between virtue ethics, as I understand it, and pretty much all forms of utilitarianism. Which would be based in the link between the justification right action and character traits. But yeah, I think that a lot of some of the objections to utilitarianism can be accommodated by utilitarians.
Yes, if I might pose a thought experiment. I imagine if we were to encounter an alien civilization that had phased out the biology of suffering, any form of experience below hedonic zero, and their lives were animated by gradients of intelligent bliss, and in wildlife parks, herbivorous creatures flourished unmolested, would you say there is anything inherently wrong or lacking with such a civilization? Would you tell its members that there is something lacking in their blissful lives, or not?
Yeah, I think although it sounds very appealing, and I think it would be appealing in many ways, I think one of the concerns might be about the valuing of other people and other creatures in such a community, because it's kind of normal for humans to die and experience death and grief in the human life, and often we think of someone incapable of grieving, that there is something wrong with them. And grief is a form of suffering and often indicates to you and others how much you value that relationship and that person. And that doesn't mean people ought to just experience grief in a sort of gratuitous way, but I think at least preserving the possibility of grieving at the passing of a loved one would be important. Yeah, so as you were asking me, David, about a community which experienced, I think bliss was what
gradients of bliss.
Yeah, gradients of bliss. And so one concern I'd have is how people in that community are able to indicate that they value others, where we can do that when we think of the experience of grief. And we now think of someone who cannot grieve as having a sort of moral deficiency, I think. And to me that's connected with, wondering about how much they valued a relationship or valued a person, a loved one who they've now lost. And so I'd be kind of wondering about what the experience of, I suppose, valuing of others and the valuing of personal relationships would be in this community.
Yes, I personally find it troubling too. However, and I think this is the important qualification, assuming we're not in some utopia where aging has been abolished, and so let's assume in this notional alien civilization that there is still death. I think the question I'd want to ask is, yes, I would want my death or misfortune to diminish the well-being of others. Am I entitled to want anyone to suffer on my account? And insofar as I want anyone to suffer on my account, I'm not convinced it's really a genuine friendship. And so when we are in a position to choose the upper and lower bounds of our hedonic range as well as hedonic set point, yes, one will want to retain the functional analogues of disappointment, maybe even grief if we haven't phased out death. But the idea that we would deliberately want to retain suffering or indeed any form of experience below hedonic zero, I find problematic. I don't know what you would...
Well, I'd be interested then in knowing more about how you would define suffering and whether it would include something like just, I suppose, missing a person, like I miss you when you've gone. Does that count as a form of suffering?
Yeah, so diminished well-being, is it suffering? Intuitively one might imagine, some people would argue that pleasure and pain are largely or wholly relative. I think this is quite a powerful intuition. But just as tragically, there are some people who spend all their lives below hedonic zero. They have chronic depression, but some days are worse than others. Likewise, I think one can anticipate a civilization in which not just the hedonic outliers, but literally all sentient beings simply experience information-sensitive gradients of well-being. So you have the analogue of missing, and you still get critical insight, social responsibility, but there isn't this texture of unpleasantness, and I'm using the term unpleasantness in the broadest sense, from mere twinges to something far more frightful. Once it becomes technically optional, do we want to retain this quality of experience? And I don't think we do, ethically speaking.
Yeah, I suppose we are used to thinking of the affective dimension of missing someone and longing for someone as somehow internally connected with the sort of valuing that we have of them. And for me it's a little hard to conceive of sort of doing away with that, but also preserving the sense that you matter to someone else in those ways, that you kind of matter directly and personally to them. But that's what you're proposing, I suppose, isn't it?
Yes, it's... No, I suppose part of me too is worried that my own particular conception of the good life, my own particular, crudely speaking, fetishes, I'm wanting to project on the rest of the world, and that yes, friendship as I understand it is something that I find really important. But what right have I, in a sense, to want anyone else to suffer on my behalf? Yes, if I were to be run over or something, I wouldn't want people to carry on partying, but would I want them to, 3 days of mourning, 3 years of uncontrollable grief? To the extent I would do so, to what extent would this really be friendship, and what extent would it be egotism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly I think when some people expect others to grieve for them for long periods of time in ways that sort of devastate their own lives, I do agree that that's a form of egotism and ethically unjustifiable. But I was thinking more of cases where, although I didn't have an exact time frame in mind, where one might reasonably expect others to grieve in the sense of missing one for a certain period of time, sort of, if you like, missing some of the good experiences that you shared together.
Yes.
And, not obviously for its own sake, but just as an indication that how much they valued you. So to me, it would feel strange, and you might think it shouldn't, but it would feel strange to think that if and when I pass away, not if but when, that
who knows?
Yeah, that's right. that others wouldn't experience any grief whatsoever. I'd sort of wonder about how much they valued our relationship.
Yes, some might say it's a cop-out answer, but this is one reason why I think we should be aiming for a triple S civilization of super happiness, super intelligence, and super longevity, is that the nastiness of death and losing someone and grieving can be dispensed with too. But realistically, this is probably a century, some would say more than a century away, and so there is a risk here of shading off into mere utopianism. But I think that should be our long-term goal, to phase out death and therefore presumably the need to grieve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds a bit speculative to me, but
it's extremely speculative, but just as to the best of our knowledge, there is no inherent reason why silicon robots are condemned to grow old and die, that we can replace their parts. In principle, it doesn't seem to be written into the laws of physics that organic robots must suffer the same fate. Now, a lot of people aren't interested in radical life extension because, probably quite reasonably, they don't think they personally are going to benefit. But in terms of our grandchildren and future generations, should we condemn them to the ravages of aging and death? Or if it is possible to treat aging as an engineering problem, should we be aiming to phase out involuntary aging and death?
It to me would lead to a very different sort of ethic to what a lot of people understand now as a good life for humans. And I'm quite persuaded by the idea of the so-called constitutive power of limits, and so I think that a future like that would lead to quite a different ethic and understanding of a good human life than what we have now. So the idea of that limits, our human limits, can have this sort of constitutive value is just, for example, the idea that part of the reason that we value courage is because we are mortal, we are vulnerable, and if we became invulnerable, then we presumably would no longer value something like courage. And part of the value of love is that it can be lost. Part of the value of trust is that you can be let down by others. That doesn't mean I think that we ought to preserve those things at any cost, no matter what. But for me, it's a little difficult to conceive of how a human life could be a flourishing life without those kinds of goods in it.
Yes, so clearly speculating about the nature of life when involuntary aging had disappeared into the dustbin of history involves a lot of speculation, but yes, I think this should be our long-term goal, simply because aging involves so much suffering, but more than so much suffering. Even if one is a virtue ethicist, one has to acknowledge that so often aging brings infirmity, cognitive infirmity, the loss of all those distinctively human virtues of courage, let's say, that made one value, if one is a virtue ethicist, life in the first instance.
True. I suppose also, though, the thought of one's impending mortality can often lead people to insights that they otherwise wouldn't have had in terms of how they understand the shape of their life as a whole, their own individual life. And I'm not necessarily thinking of the way that some people, as they approach the end of their own lives, turn to religion. I'm not thinking about that. I'm more thinking about how they can start to almost, have perhaps different virtues, and in the way that they face those challenges, and in leading them perhaps to reconcile with other people in ways they hadn't before. And for me, a classic thing is what I call post-retirement shame, where some people who in their professional capacity have done things that they had excused themselves of, saying it was just part of the adversarial system, say if they're a criminal defence lawyer, and it was my legal self that did it. Often when people retire, they write their memoirs, get very candid, want to get things off their chest and say, no, actually I own it. I feel ashamed of having done certain things in my professional capacity, and sort of reveal to the world things that maybe they wouldn't have if their career had continued indefinitely.
Right, yes, I hadn't considered this possibility. Perhaps I could just bring up another question. Obviously, perhaps the vast majority of suffering in the world is undergone by beings who are not capable of being of virtue, at least in the sense that adult humans would use the term, non-human animals. What do you think about the prospect, which until recently could only be called science fiction, but now at least may well be technically feasible, of phasing out the horrors of predation, hunger, the nastiness of Darwinian life red in tooth and claw?
I think that's a really interesting proposal, and I agree that it's difficult to talk about non-human animals as having virtues. I think nonetheless that Aristotelians can still understand what is a good for a particular creature and a good life for it in terms of its own particular characteristics. And so when we think of what's an excellent specimen of like a Burmese cat or something, and we then, like you might find at the Royal Melbourne Show starting in a couple of weeks, that we can get a sense of what would be flourishing for that species. And some species are social and others are not, like polar bears apparently. And so I still think the idea of tying a flourishing life to the nature of that particular species makes sense, even if they don't need virtues or couldn't develop virtues to help them flourish. So then, to answer your more specific question about predation, I hadn't thought about the possibility of eliminating it completely, and I'm not one who argues that simply because something is natural, therefore it's right. I don't think there's a valid deductive argument from that premise to that conclusion so straightforwardly. But I do think that inductively it's important to look at and try to understand the essential nature of a creature to then understand what would count as a flourishing life for it. That probably doesn't fully answer your question about predation though, because then the question is, well, what counts as flourishing for one species can only be achieved at the cost of the flourishing of another. I'm not sure what to say about that. I don't know whether to think, for example, that if a species is typically more sophisticated cognitively, that therefore it has a stronger claim to be left alone to be kind of predatory over the other? I'm not sure what to think about that. It's a very good question, I think.
It's in a sense built into the nature of, let's say, members of the cat family. They are obligate carnivores. Of course, when a cat is playing or tormenting a mouse, the cat doesn't conceive the harm and the suffering, the terror of the mouse, but nonetheless it is part of the cat's intrinsic nature. Or another example, consider that, the noble lion, the king of the beasts. The noble lion, king of the beasts, will, if he or she comes into the neighbouring tribe, wins a fight with the rival male, and then kills the rival male's cubs because they prevent the female coming on heat again, i.e. infanticide, all sorts of behaviour that in humans would be regarded as extraordinarily depraved is quite natural to members of the cat family. And as I said, until recently this would just be poetry. When Buddha says, "May all that hath life be delivered from suffering," no one thinks he's seriously proposing any sort of interventions to eliminate the food chain. This is one thing that high technology does do, that every cubic metre of the planet will be computationally accessible to micromanagement and control, and for better or worse, we will be akin to gods. We can choose what life forms and states of consciousness will exist. I hope we will be benevolent gods, and being a benevolent god entails not allowing gratuitous suffering to occur.
It's a very interesting proposal. I guess I'm slightly wary as well as of thinking that the way humans understand what's right and wrong is something that should be applied to all animals. Where I tend to think we're very sort of human-centric, anthropocentric people when it comes to thinking about ethics. And so, although I to some extent share your concerns about the suffering, say, of a mouse when the cat is just playing with it for fun and for sport, and I agree, it does seem to be part of the nature of a cat to do that. I do wonder about how much we're assuming about what's going on, what the experiential side of that is for the cat or the mouse. I mean, it's still obviously pretty terrible for the mouse. So I guess I'd be interested to know more about the feasibility of trying to eliminate things like predation as well.